The ghost of Stalingrad. Why Hitler refused retreat and lost everything. But doesn't this fascination with catastrophic decisions, with the stubborn refusal to back down even when faced with utter ruin, strike a chord? Is it just a morbid curiosity about history, or a deeper anxiety about the moments in our own lives when pride blinds us, when we cling to a failing course of action even as disaster looms, unable to admit defeat? Perhaps by understanding the colossal miscalculations of a dictator, we might glimpse the echoes of those same human frailties within ourselves. The year is 1942. The world is a crucible of war, steel and fire reshaping nations. For Adolf Hitler and his seemingly invincible Wehrmacht, the Eastern Front, the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Soviet Union, was meant to be the final, glorious stage of conquest. Operation Barbarossa, launched a year earlier, had seen German armies rip through Soviet defenses, pushing deeper and deeper into the endless plains. Yet, that initial lightning speed had bogged down in the mud, then frozen in the brutal grip of the Russian winter. The Soviets, though battered, had not broken. Now, as spring thaw gave way to summer's scorching heat, Hitler had a new plan, an audacious gamble he believed would finally deliver the knockout blow. Operation Blue. This wasn't just about territory or resources anymore, though the oil fields of the Caucasus were a significant prize. This was about symbolism, about breaking the Soviet will, about crushing the very heart of Stalin's industrial and ideological power. And at the center of this new grand strategy, a city that bore the Soviet leader's name, Stalingrad. A city stretched thin along the Volga River, a vital artery for Soviet supply and communication. To capture Stalingrad was to sever that artery, to humiliate Stalin, and to open the gates to the oil that fueled the Soviet war machine. Hitler was convinced that once Stalingrad fell, the Soviet Union would collapse like a house of cards. His generals, many seasoned veterans who understood the logistical nightmares and sheer scale of fighting in Russia, harbored private doubts. But in the Third Reich, dissent was a dangerous game. The German Sixth Army, under the command of General Friedrich Paulus, was the tip of this spear. A man of quiet demeanor, meticulous, a staff officer more than a field commander, Paulus was tasked with achieving the impossible. His forces, alongside other Axis allies, streamed towards the city, confident, if perhaps a little weary from the relentless advance. The fighting began in earnest in late August 1942. Luftwaffe bombers, the infamous Stukas with their terrifying siren wail, turned much of Stalingrad into a moonscape of rubble and twisted metal. It was a blitzkrieg from the sky, designed to shatter resistance before ground troops even entered. Yet, even as the city burned, the Soviet defenders, led by General Vasily Chukov and his 62nd Army, refused to yield. This wasn't just another battle. It was a struggle for existence. Stalin's infamous, "Not one step back," Order number 227 had instilled a brutal determination. Retreat meant execution. Standing meant a chance, however slim. The nature of the fighting quickly devolved into something truly nightmarish. This wasn't the open-field maneuver warfare the Wehrmacht excelled at. This was Rattenkrieg, rat war. A brutal, building-by-building, room-by-room struggle for survival amidst the ruins. Snipers became legends, both German and Soviet, picking off targets from shattered windows and collapsed rooftops. Every cellar, every factory, every grain silo became a fortress, changing hands multiple times a day, often in savage hand-to-hand combat. The famous Pavlov's house, a multi-story apartment building, held out for 58 days against overwhelming German attacks, becoming a symbol of Soviet tenacity. This was a battle fought in the dust and debris, where distances were measured in meters, and the enemy was often just a floor above or below you. Hitler, miles away in his headquarters, grew increasingly obsessed with Stalingrad. He saw it not just as a strategic objective, but as a personal trophy. His pronouncements became more frequent, more demanding. He repeatedly declared that the city must fall, that German troops would never leave. This wasn't just rhetoric. It was a direct order, overriding any tactical considerations or pleas from his commanders on the ground. The reality was that his armies were being bled dry in the urban meat grinder. The Sixth Army, once mighty, was suffering horrific casualties. Supplies were becoming increasingly difficult to deliver, especially ammunition and food. The sheer vastness of the front lines meant that German forces were stretched thin, their flanks exposed. Meanwhile, the Soviets, under the strategic genius of Marshal Georgy Zhukov, were not just defending. They were planning. Their counteroffensive, codenamed Operation Uranus, was a masterpiece of deception and timing. While the Germans were pouring everything they had into the Stalingrad cauldron, Zhukov was massing vast reserves, tanks, artillery, fresh infantry, to the north and south of the city, targeting the weaker Romanian and Hungarian armies protecting the German flanks. It was a classic pincer movement, designed to encircle the entire German Sixth Army. The stage was set for a catastrophe of unimaginable scale, yet Hitler, caught in his own hubris, seemed utterly blind to the impending doom. He was convinced the Soviets were broken, that they lacked the capacity for such a massive coordinated attack. On November 19, 1942, Operation Uranus struck. The Soviet forces, spearheaded by hundreds of tanks, smashed through the Axis lines to the north. A day later, the southern pincer attacked with equal ferocity. The Axis allies, poorly equipped and often lacking heavy anti-tank weapons, crumbled quickly. Within 4 days, on November 23, the two Soviet pincer arms met at Kalikondan, sealing off the entire German Sixth Army and elements of the 4th Panzer Army, approximately 300,000 Axis soldiers, inside a vast pocket around Stalingrad. The immediate reaction from German field commanders was one of shock and a desperate scramble for orders. General Paulus and his staff immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. They were trapped. Their most pressing recommendation was a breakout attempt, a desperate gamble to smash through the Soviet lines and reconnect with friendly forces before their supplies ran out and the freezing Russian winter tightened its icy grip. But here, Hitler's fatal flaw became glaringly apparent. When the news of the encirclement reached him, his response was not to analyze the tactical reality but to dig in his heels. He declared that there would be no retreat, no breakout. The Sixth Army was to hold Stalingrad, transforming it into a fortress. This order was catastrophic. A breakout, even a risky one, offered the best, perhaps only, chance for a significant portion of the trapped army to escape. Every hour lost made the Soviet lines stronger, the encirclement tighter. Why did Hitler refuse? His motivations were a complex, toxic brew of strategic miscalculation, psychological rigidity, and a profound, almost messianic belief in his own infallible judgment. Strategically, he believed that abandoning Stalingrad would unravel the entire southern front, leaving the oil fields of the Caucasus, his primary objective for the summer campaign, exposed. He clung to the idea that Stalingrad was a vital linchpin, even as it became a death trap. This was compounded by a profound underestimation of Soviet capabilities. Hitler consistently believed the Red Army was on its last legs, unable to sustain such large-scale offensives. He saw their advances as temporary setbacks, not indicators of a fundamental shift in the war's momentum. Psychologically, Hitler was a prisoner of his own past successes. The rapid victories in France, Poland, and the early stages of Barbarossa had convinced him that his intuition was superior to that of his professional generals. He mistrusted their caution, viewing it as weakness. The word retreat was anathema to him, a symbol of failure he refused to countenance. For a man who built his regime on an image of invincible power and unwavering will, admitting defeat at Stalingrad, a city bearing his nemesis's name, was simply unthinkable. It would be a blow to his prestige, a crack in the facade of invincibility, both to his own people and to the world. A critical example of this psychological rigidity manifested in his direct intervention in military matters. He frequently overruled his generals, often with disastrous consequences, believing himself a military genius. This overconfidence was bolstered by early victories where his intuition seemed to pay off, reinforcing his dangerous belief in his own infallibility. Adding to this deadly mix was the intervention of Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe. Göring, ever eager to curry favor with Hitler and desperate to maintain the prestige of his air force, boasted that the Luftwaffe could supply the trapped Sixth Army by air. This was a fantastical claim, physically impossible given the numbers involved. To adequately supply 300,000 men with food, fuel, ammunition, and medical supplies would require hundreds of transport planes flying multiple sorties daily, through hostile airspace, in increasingly severe winter weather. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin across multiple fronts, simply did not possess the aircraft or the logistical capacity. Yet, Hitler, perhaps wanting to believe a solution existed that didn't involve retreat, latched onto Göring's hollow promise. He ordered the Sixth Army to hold, promising them relief via air supply and a future ground offensive to break the encirclement. The promise of an airlift quickly proved to be a cruel deception. The planes were too few, the distances too great, the Soviet anti-aircraft fire and fighter planes too effective. The few supplies that did get through were a trickle, a fraction of what was needed. Soldiers inside the Kessel, as the Germans called the pocket, began to starve. Their ammunition dwindled. The cold, a relentless and unforgiving enemy, began to claim lives with increasing regularity. Temperatures plummeted to -30°C and below. Without proper winter clothing, without adequate food, men succumbed to frostbite, hypothermia, and disease. The wounded froze to death in makeshift aid stations, their pleas for help turning into rattling breaths in the icy air. It was a slow, agonizing death for thousands, meticulously documented in the diaries and letters smuggled out by the few planes that did escape. Meanwhile, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most brilliant operational commanders, was tasked with organizing a relief effort, Operation Winterstorm. He assembled a force of panzer divisions and infantry, but they were depleted, under strength, and facing a formidable Soviet defense. Manstein's forces fought valiantly, pushing to within 48 kilometers of the Stalingrad pocket. At this point, a critical decision point emerged. Manstein urged Paulus to attempt a breakout, a desperate dash to link up with the relief force. The plan, codenamed Thunderclap, required Paulus to abandon Stalingrad and fight his way west. It was a risky move, but it offered the trapped army its last real chance. Again, Hitler intervened. He absolutely forbade Paulus from attempting a breakout. His orders were explicit: hold Stalingrad. Paulus, a professional soldier who believed in following orders, was caught in an impossible bind. He knew the situation was hopeless, but he was bound by his oath and Hitler's direct command. This was the true ghost of Stalingrad, the specter of absolute authority overriding military logic, sacrificing an entire army on the altar of one man's ego. The relief force, without a corresponding breakout from inside the pocket, was forced to withdraw, unable to penetrate the robust Soviet lines. The hope that had flickered for a brief moment in the frozen wastes vanished, replaced by the grim certainty of doom. As January 1943 wore on, the situation inside the Kessel became truly apocalyptic. The perimeter shrank under relentless Soviet pressure. Artillery bombardments were constant. German airfields within the pocket, vital for any meager air supply, were captured one by one, further isolating the trapped forces. The starving, freezing soldiers, many suffering from typhus and dysentery, were at the absolute limits of human endurance. They ate horses, then dogs, then anything remotely edible. Morale plummeted, though a strange, grim camaraderie often developed amongst the dying. The radio messages from the Kessel became increasingly desperate, painting a stark picture of utter devastation and unimaginable suffering. On January 30, 1943, on the 10th anniversary of his seizure of power, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, a symbolic gesture designed to prevent him from surrendering. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. It was a thinly veiled instruction: fight to the last man, commit suicide if necessary, but do not capitulate. Yet, by this point, surrender was not a choice but an inevitability for an army that had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. On January 31st, the southern half of the Kessel, including Paulus and his staff, surrendered. 2 days later, on February 2nd, the remaining northern forces also laid down their arms. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. The human cost was staggering. Of the approximately 300,000 Axis soldiers encircled, around 91,000 survived to be taken prisoner. But their ordeal was far from over. Marched into Soviet captivity, Many died on the long, brutal trek to prison camps, succumbing to wounds, disease, and starvation. Only about 5,000 of them would ever see Germany again, some returning as late as the mid-1950s. The Soviet Union also paid a horrific price, losing an estimated 1.1 million military personnel in and around Stalingrad, making it one of the bloodiest battles in human history. The city itself was utterly pulverized, a testament to the savagery of the conflict. The defeat at Stalingrad was more than just a military loss. It was a psychological earthquake that reverberated across the globe. For Germany, it shattered the myth of the Wehrmacht's invincibility. The initial shock gave way to a somber realization that the tide of the war had turned. Hitler's seemingly infallible judgment was now openly questioned, albeit quietly, within the highest echelons of the military. It signaled the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. While the war would drag on for another 2 years, the initiative had irrevocably shifted to the Allies. The Eastern Front, which had once been the stage for German triumphs, became a relentless grinder that steadily consumed Hitler's armies. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad was a monumental victory, a turning point that galvanized the nation and proved their resilience. It demonstrated that they could not only stop the German war machine but also decisively defeat it in a major offensive operation. It was a powerful symbol of defiance against an enemy that sought to erase them from existence. The battle became a foundational myth of Soviet heroism and sacrifice, a testament to the indomitable spirit of its people. And what of the ghost of Stalingrad? It is the chilling echo of a leader so consumed by his own ego, so blinded by ideology and an irrational refusal to concede, that he willingly sacrificed an entire army. It stands as a stark warning against the dangers of unchecked power and the catastrophic consequences when personal pride trumps military reality. Hitler's refusal to retreat was not just a tactical error, it was a moral abandonment, a deliberate choice to let hundreds of thousands of his own soldiers die in a frozen wasteland for the sake of a name, for the sake of his twisted vision of invincibility. The lessons of Stalingrad resonate far beyond the battlefields of World War II. They whisper of the inherent human struggle to admit fault, to change course, to prioritize lives over pride. They remind us that even the most powerful leaders can be undone by their own hubris, their own inability to adapt to changing circumstances. The spectral figures of those frozen, starving German soldiers, trapped and abandoned in the ruins of a city named for their enemy, serve as a timeless, harrowing testament to the ultimate price of such intransigence. It is a story that forces us to look inward, to consider the moments in our own lives when we, too, might be tempted to hold our ground, not out of strength, but out of a paralyzing fear of admitting defeat. And in doing so, perhaps we can learn to heed the warnings that the ghost of Stalingrad still whispers from the icy plains of Russia.